Elias Kane had not spoken to another human in almost 3 months. That suited him fine. The mountains gave him everything he needed: meat from the deer that roamed the high valleys, fresh water from the streams that carved their way through, granite and solitude deep enough to muffle the ghosts of his past. He had built his cabin by hand on a ridge 2 days' ride from the nearest town. Down in those crowded saloons, men drank away their wages and filled the air with lies. Up here, the only voices were the wind in the pines and the groan of timber. In the cold night air, that evening, the sky had turned the color of tarnished silver, heavy clouds rolling in from the west. Elias had been tracking a young elk through the timberline, hoping to bring down enough meat to last the early winter. But the storm moved faster than he expected, driving sheets of rain through the trees and turning the trail into a slick mess of mud and roots. By the time he reached the ridge where his cabin sat, darkness had swallowed the forest whole. The wind was a living thing, moaning through the chimney as Elias trudged up the narrow path toward home. His boots were soaked, the cold biting at his fingers. The glow from his lantern cut a small circle in the darkness, and as he stepped into the clearing, something caught his eyes, something that didn't belong. At first it looked like a shadow, swaying against the cabin's side. The wind tugged at it, rocking it gently, and for a moment he thought some old tarp had come loose from the roofline. But as he drew closer, the shape took form, a human form. His steps slowed. The wind rattled the shingles above as rain spattered against his lantern glass. She was hanging by her wrists, bound with rope to one of the heavy beams that jutted from his roof. Her head hung forward, long wet strands of blonde hair plastered to her face. The dim light glistened on pale skin streaked with rain. Elias's heart gave a hard thump. He set the lantern down in the mud, the flame flickering wildly in the wind. One hand went to the knife on his belt, not because she was a threat, but because men who left a woman in such a state were often still close by. He stepped forward, the boards beneath the overhang creaking under his weight. Up close, he could hear the faint sound of her breathing, shallow, uneven rasp. She was alive, but barely. Her dress was torn, mud smeared across the hem and sleeves. As his eyes traveled over her, they stopped at the mark on her shoulder. It was not ink, it was not paint, it was a brand. The flesh was an angry, blistered red. The letters burned deep and crude. Apache lover. Elias's jaw tightened. Whoever had done this wanted her to carry that scar to her grave. The burn was fresh, the edges still weeping. Rage welled in his chest, hot and choking. He pulled his hunting knife from its sheath and sliced through the ropes with a single sharp stroke. She collapsed into his arms, limp as a rag, her head rolling against his chest. She weighed little, her frame gaunt, as if she hadn't eaten in days. Elias kicked open the cabin door, the hinges groaning in protest, and carried her inside. The fire in the hearth had gone out while he was gone, so the air inside was cold, smelling faintly of wood smoke and pine pitch. He laid her gently on his bed, covering her with a thick wool blanket he kept folded at the foot. The lantern light cast long shadows on the log walls as Elias worked quickly. He fetched water from the basin, soaking a clean cloth and pressing it to her forehead. Her skin was clammy, her pulse weak but steady. For a long moment, he just sat there, staring at the brand. Questions rattled in his mind. Who was she? Why was she here, in the middle of nowhere, strung up like a warning sign? And more pressing, were the ones who did this still out there in the storm, waiting for him to make a mistake? Outside, the wind howled louder, bending the pines until they creaked like old ships in a gale. The storm had swallowed the mountains, and with it, any chance of getting her to help before morning. Elias Kane, a man who had built his life on keeping to himself, now found himself with a half-dead stranger in his bed and danger prowling in the dark just beyond his cabin walls, and somewhere in the back of his mind, a grim certainty began to take root. This was no accident. Someone had left her here for him to find. Elias didn't waste time wondering. If she was going to survive the night, he needed to work fast. He stoked the fire in the hearth until flames leapt up, casting an orange glow through the cabin. The shadows shifted across the walls, dancing around the tools and antlers that hung there. Heat slowly began to creep back into the room. The woman stirred under the blanket, a faint sound catching in her throat. Her eyes fluttered open blue, sharp, even in her weakness, but the moment she saw him, panic flashed across her face. She jerked back, her hands clawing at the blanket, as if she thought he might tie her up again. "Easy," Ilias said, his voice low and steady, the way he might talk to a spooked horse. "You're safe now." Her breath came fast and shallow. She pressed herself against the headboard, eyes darting to the door, then to the knife on his belt. "I cut you down," he explained. "You were on my roof, hanging." At that, her gaze shifted, searching his face for some sign of deceit. When she spoke, her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. Where are they?" Ilias's brow furrowed, her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "The men." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, wincing at the movement. They'll come back, they always do." There was fear in her voice, but also something else, certainty. Whoever she was running from, they weren't finished. Rose from the bed and crossed to the cupboard, pouring water into a tin cup. He held it out to her, but she hesitated, as though unsure whether to trust him. Only after a long pause did she take it, her fingers trembling so badly that half the water sloshed onto the blanket. "What's your name?" he asked. She sipped, coughed, and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Claire." Her cracked on the single word, as though speaking it had cost her more strength than she had. "Well, Claire," Elias said, "you're safe for now. This storm will keep anyone from finding us until morning." Her eyes lifted to his, sharp again. Despite her exhaustion, "No, you don't understand. They don't stop. Storm or no storm, they'll come." Elias had heard that kind of conviction before. Years back, when his wife was still alive, she had said the same thing about a man who wanted her dead. She'd been right. The memory made his jaw tighten. He pulled a chair to the bed and sat, leaning forward, forearms resting on his knees. "You want to tell me why they hung you from my roof like a damn scarecrow?" Claire's gaze dropped to the blanket, and for a long moment she didn't answer. The fire popped in the silence. When she finally spoke, her words were quiet, almost buried beneath the storm outside. "Because I loved the wrong man." Elias waited, but she didn't elaborate. Her breathing grew uneven, and he saw the pain creeping into her expression as the warmth began to wake her nerves. The brand on her shoulder looked angrier now, the edges swollen. Infection would come quickly in this cold, damp weather. He rose again, fetched a small jar from the shelf above the hearth, and opened it. The sharp scent of pine resin and bare fat filled the air. He scooped some onto a cloth and returned to her side. "This'll hurt," he warned. She didn't flinch. Didn't even look at him, just stared into the fire as he pressed the salve to the burned flesh. Her jaw tightened, her fingers digging into the blanket. But she didn't make a sound. That kind of silence didn't come from strength alone. It came from someone who had learned that crying out only made things worse. When he was done, Elias set the cloth aside and adjusted the blanket around her. "Try to sleep," he said. Her eyes closed, but she didn't relax. Even in rest, her body stayed taut, like she was ready to run at any moment. Elias remained seated, watching her and listening to the storm batter the cabin walls. He thought of the words burned into her skin. Apache lover. Whoever had done it hadn't meant just to hurt her, they'd meant to send a message. The problem was, if they knew his cabin, they knew him. And men like that didn't leave loose ends. Ilias's hand drifted to the rifle propped against the wall. If they came for her, they'd have to walk through him first. And he wasn't the kind of man who let wolves inside his den. Somewhere outside, faint beneath the wind, he thought he heard the sound of hooves. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a steady glow, the kind that wrapped the cabin in a dim amber light. Outside, the wind tore through the pines with a low, constant roar, and rain hissed against the roof like 1,000 whispering voices. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled, slow and deep. Echoing through the mountains, Elias sat at the table, his rifle within arm's reach, eyes fixed on the door. The faint sound of hooves he'd heard earlier gnawed at him, though the storm had a way of playing tricks on the ears. Claire lay in his bed, her breathing slow but restless, shifting every so often as if trapped in some dark dream. When she finally stirred, it wasn't with panic this time. She opened her eyes slowly, squinting in the firelight. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. "You haven't slept." "Didn't plan to," Elias said without looking at her. "Not until I know what I'm dealing with." For a long moment, the only sound was the rain and the soft crackle of burning wood. Then she pulled herself up on her elbows, wincing as the movement tugged at the wound on her shoulder. "They'll come for me," she said quietly, her gaze fixed on the floor. "They don't care who gets in the way. You keep me here. You put yourself in the line of fire." Elias finally turned. "To face her, already am, far as I can tell." She met his eyes for the first time without flinching. "Then you deserve to know why." She drew in a slow breath, as if the words themselves weighed more than she could carry. "I loved a man, a good man. His name was Nantan. He was Apache. We met when I was living in a small settlement near the San Pedro River. He worked with his tribe trading horses, and one day I helped him when he was being cheated by a merchant. After that, we saw each other whenever we could." Her voice faltered, and Elias could see her knuckles whitening around the edge of the blanket. "The others didn't take kindly to it," she continued. "Some whispered, some spat at me in the street, but a few decided I needed to be taught a lesson." She gave a bitter laugh with no humor in it. "You can guess the kind of lesson they had in mind." Elias's jaw tightened, his mind flashing back to another time, another face his wife. Mariowen, a different kind of hate, had come knocking. "What happened to him?" Elias asked. She stared into the fire, her voice turning thin. "They killed him, came in the night. Shot him where he stood, then dragged me out. Said if I wanted to lie down with savages, then I could wear the mark of it until I died." Her fingers touched the edge of the burn on her shoulder, and for a moment she seemed far away, lost in the memory of it. Elias didn't speak. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the sigh of wind against the cabin walls. He understood the way people could carry cruelty in their bones, the way it could twist a man into something less than human. "You were running when they found you?" he asked at last. She nodded. "I thought I'd lost them, but they're good trackers. I guess I wasn't fast enough." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't even know where I am anymore." "You're in my cabin," Elias said. "Hi. Up the Rockies, half a day's ride from the nearest town. No one stumbles up here by accident." Her brow furrowed. "Then how?" She stopped herself, shaking her head. "Doesn't matter. They'll find this place." Elias leaned back in his chair, studying her. She was worn thin, her cheeks hollow from days without proper food, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and yet there was steel in her voice, a stubbornness that told him she'd fought hard to make it this far. "You get some rest," he said. "We'll deal with them when the time comes." She gave a humorless smile. "We," Elias shrugged, turning, his gaze back to the fire. "Storm like this, you're not going anywhere tonight. That makes you my problem until morning." For a while, neither spoke. The storm swelled outside, rattling the shutters. In the distance, he was sure of it, this time came the faint rhythm of hooves on wet earth. Elisa's hand drifted toward the rifle. Claire heard it too. Her eyes snapped to the door, and a shiver ran through her. Elias met her gaze, his voice low. "Looks like morning's come early." The sound came clearer. Now 3 horses, maybe 4. Their hooves muffled by the wet earth, but steady, purposeful. Elias's grip tightened on the rifle. Beside him, Claire was already drawing the blanket tighter around herself, eyes wide and fixed on the door. The hoofbeats stopped just beyond the tree line. Silence fell for a breath. Then came the slow creak of leather, the jingle of spurs. Shadows moved at the edge of the clearing. A heavy knock sounded against the door. Not the polite kind, but the kind that carried an unspoken warning. "Open up." A man's voice called deep, rough, used to giving orders. Elias stayed where he was. Storms too rough for visitors. Best keep riding. A pause. Then the voice came again, lower now, almost amused. We're not here to visit, friend. We're here for the girl. Claire flinched at the words. Elias saw the way her fingers dug into the blanket. He rose slowly, stepping to the door but not opening it. Ain't no girl here, he said, his tone flat. The man outside chuckled. We saw her tracks. Followed em right to your door. We'll be taking her off your hands. Less trouble for you that way. Elias glanced at Claire. Her face was pale, lips pressed tight, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. You're gonna want to ride out, Elias said, his voice quiet but hard. Silence stretched for a moment. Then the reply came, sharper this time. Open the door, old man. Now. Elias shifted the rifle into his hands, the wood worn smooth from years of use. With his other hand, he pulled back the bolt just enough for the click to carry through the door. The man outside laughed again, but this time it was colder. That a threat? That's a warning. There was movement outside, a shuffle of boots, the soft clink of metal. Elias risked a quick glance through the gap in the shutter. 3 men stood in the clearing, rain dripping off their hats. The one in the middle wore a necklace of Apache beads, the bright colors dulled by grime. Elias knew what those beads meant. They weren't bought, they were taken. The leader lifted his chin toward the cabin. Last chance. Cain. Elias's gut tightened. They knew his name. That's right, the man said, catching the reaction. We asked around. Folks in town said you liked to keep to yourself. Figured you wouldn't want trouble. But trouble's here, so hand her over, and maybe we won't burn your little shack to the ground. Claire's breathing quickened. She was trembling now, but not from the cold. Elias stepped away from the window, meeting her gaze. Back room, stay down. I'm not leaving you now, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. She hesitated only a heartbeat before slipping off the bed and disappearing into the small back room. Pulling the door shut behind her, Elias turned back to the front, raising his voice just enough to carry Q. You picked the wrong ridge to ride up. The leader spat into the mud. And you picked the wrong girl to save. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men shifted, resting a hand on the butt of his revolver. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. The leader saw it and grinned. Not tonight, Cain. Storm's bad enough to keep us here a while. We'll make ourselves comfortable till morning. Then we'll take her. They backed away toward the tree line, not retreating, just melting into the dark edges of the clearing. Elias knew they weren't leaving, not really. They'd circle the cabin, wait for the right moment. He closed the shutters, dropped the bar across the door, and added more wood to the fire. His mind was already working, counting their numbers. Thinking of the land around the cabin, the old trails and blind corners that could be used to his advantage. In the back room, he could hear Claire's breathing, quick and uneven. She was trying to be quiet, but fear has a way of making itself heard. Elias sat back down at the table, rifle across his lap. The storm still raged, but now the real danger was closer than the wind. He had until dawn, maybe less, before they made their move. He glanced at the closed door to the back room, then at the dark windows. Let 'em come, he muttered. The hours between midnight and dawn stretched long in the mountains, and Elias could feel every minute drag across his nerves. The storm still clawed at the cabin, rain hammering the roof in bursts, wind whistling through the gaps in the shutters, but underneath it all, there were sounds that didn't belong: the faint crunch of boots in wet pine needles, the occasional jingle of metal, and once the low murmur of a man's voice carried by the wind. They were out there, waiting. Elias rose from the table, moved to the back room, and eased the door open. Claire was sitting on the floor, knees pulled to her chest, her head jerking up as he entered. They haven't left, she whispered. I know, he said. Which means we can't wait for morning. She frowned. You think we can get past them? Elias glanced toward the front of the cabin. If we go out the door, no. But there's a trail behind the ridge they won't know about. It's narrow, steep, bad footing in the rain. But it leads to an old mining shack a mile out. We can hole up there until I figure the next step. Claire looked doubtful, but there was no fear in her eyes, now only resolve. Then let's move. Elias pulled his coat from the peg on the wall and shrugged it on. He handed her his spare wool coat, far too big for her, but it would keep her warm enough to make the climb. She slid her arms into it without complaint. From the hearth, he grabbed one of the thick burning logs and carried it to the door. "Stay close behind me," he said, "and no matter what happens, keep moving." The moment he cracked the door open, the wind tore into the cabin, lashing them with cold rain. He stepped out into the storm, holding the burning log high. For a heartbeat, there was no movement in the trees. Then, from the edge of the clearing, a shadow shifted. Elias hurled the log into the darkness. It landed in a spray of sparks and smoke, hitting something solid. Someone cursed and stumbled back. That was all the distraction they needed. Elias barked. Claire darted out, keeping low, her boots sinking into the wet ground. Elias was right behind her, moving toward the back corner of the cabin, where the ridge began to slope upward into the forest. The rain masked their footsteps, but the shouts behind them cut through the storm like gunfire. They're running, a pistol cracked, the shot muffled by the wind. Bark splintered from a pine just ahead of Claire. Elias grabbed her arm and yanked her toward the narrow cut in the ridge deer trail, half hidden by brush and loose rock. The climb was brutal in the rain. Mud sucked at their boots, and the wet stones shifted treacherously underfoot. More gunfire echoed from the clearing, but the shots were wild blind guesses in the storm. Still, Elias kept her moving, his hand gripping her coat collar when she stumbled. By the time they reached the top, the cabin was barely visible through the trees, its glow faint against the darkness. Elias knew they didn't have long before the men figured out where they'd gone. "Keep moving," he said, breath fogging in the cold air. They followed the narrow path along the ridge, weaving between jagged outcroppings of granite and old, gnarled pines. Claire's breathing was ragged now, each step a battle against exhaustion. The wound on her shoulder slowed her, but she never asked to stop. Finally, the silhouette of the old mining shack emerged from the shadows, a sagging structure of weathered boards and rusted tin. Elias pushed the door open, the hinges screaming in protest, and ushered her inside. The air was damp and smelled of rot, but the walls would cut the wind. Elias set his rifle near the door and checked the corners. Empty. Safe, for now. Claire sank onto the floor, leaning against the wall, her hair plastered to her face. She looked up at him with tired eyes. "How long do you think we have?" "Long enough to catch our breath," Elias said. He crouched beside her, inspecting the burn on her shoulder. The rain had soaked through the salve, and the skin looked worse. "This is going to need tending again." She nodded faintly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can keep going." Elias met her gaze. "You might have to." Outside, the storm raged on, but he knew it wouldn't hide them forever. The men out there were trackers, and the rain would only delay them for so long. The real question was whether he'd be ready when they found this place. He reached for his rifle, his mind already turning to the terrain outside, the narrow approach, the deadfall just beyond the shack, the rocks that could serve as cover. If they wanted to take her, they'd have to come through him. The morning after their narrow escape was grey and damp, with a mist curling low through the pines. Elias and Clara had made camp in a rocky hollow, sheltered from the wind by a jutting cliff. A small fire crackled between them, its smoke trailing up into the overcast sky. Elias kept his rifle close, eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He knew the men who'd come for Clara weren't finished, not yet. Clara sat across from him, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. She hadn't spoken much since they fled the cabin, her gaze fixed on the flames as though the answers to everything might dance in the embers. Elias had learned not to push. Mountain silence could heal, but it could also hide wounds deeper than flesh. "You're safe for now," Elias said finally, breaking the quiet. His voice was low, calm, but there was an edge beneath it. "But you need to tell me why. Are they hunting you? Clara's eyes flicked to his, searching his expression for judgment before she looked away again. Because of who I loved, she murmured. Because I chose someone they think I shouldn't have. Ilias's jaw tightened. He didn't need to ask who. The brand on her shoulder Apache lover told him everything. She went on, her voice trembling. His name was Tuzza. He was Mescalero Apache. We met when the trading post near the reservation hired me as a bookkeeper. He was kind and brave. But the ranchers hated him, hated his people. When they found out about us, she broke off, shaking her head as if trying to push away the memory. They called it betrayal. They said I was worse than a thief or a killer. Elias had seen that kind of hatred before, wild, blind, and dangerous. He poked at the fire, his mind working. And the men last night? Ranch hands, Clara said bitterly. They're paid to keep me quiet, to make an example out of me. She swallowed hard. They think no one will care if I vanish. They're probably right. Elias's gaze hardened. They're wrong. Before either of them could say more, a sound echoed faintly through the mist, a sharp crack of a twig, then another. Elias motioned for Clara to stay low, then crouched, rifle in hand, moving silently toward the edge of the hollow. Through the veil of fog, 3 silhouettes emerged between the trees, moving cautiously, rifles slung but ready. He ducked back down. 3 of them, maybe more. They're tracking us. Fear flickered across Clara's face, but Elias was already moving, scanning the terrain. The hollow had one narrow exit, a funnel between 2 boulders. Perfect for an ambush. Get behind that rock, he told her. No matter what happens, you don't move unless I tell you. Clara nodded, clutching the blanket around her. Elias took position at the bottleneck, his rifle barrel resting on a flat stone. The mist worked in his favor. The men wouldn't see him until it was too late. The first shadow appeared, then resolved into a man's phaser, stranger, but with the same hard-eyed look as the others. Elias waited until he stepped into the gap, then barked. That's far enough. The man froze, raising a hand. We're just looking for a runaway friend. Not looking for trouble. You found trouble anyway, Elias said flatly. Second man slid into view, trying to circle wide. Elias's finger tightened on the trigger. I see you back there. Take one more step, and I drop you where you stand. The men exchanged glances, weighing their chances. The third voice came from deeper in the mist. You can't keep her, mountain man. She ain't yours. She ain't yours either. Elias shot back. Now, get off my mountain. There was a long, tense pause. Then, muttering curses, the shadows melted back into the trees. Elias waited, listening for any sign they'd doubled back. Only the wind moved. He returned to the fire, finding Clara with her hands shaking despite the blanket. They'll be back, she whispered. Elias nodded grimly. Then we'll be ready. But in his gut, he knew this wasn't a fight. They could win by hiding. The men hunting her wouldn't stop. If they wanted to survive, they'd have to go on the offensive. Tomorrow, he decided, they'd stop running. The wind carried the sharp scent of sage and wood smoke as Elias and Clara rode into the Apache camp. The settlement was tucked between jagged cliffs, half hidden by the twisting path of the canyon. Children paused their play to stare. Men stepped forward, bows slung across their backs, and women whispered to each other, their eyes wary of the 2 strangers. Elias kept one hand loosely on his rifle, though he hoped he wouldn't have to use it. Clara, sitting behind him on the mule, kept her chin high, but he could feel her trembling. They'd traveled in tense silence since leaving the cabin. The only sound was the dull thud of hooves on dirt and the low murmur of the wind funneling through the rocks. At the edge of the camp, an older Apache man stepped forward. His hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp and assessing. He wore a deerskin shirt and carried a ceremonial staff. Elias guessed immediately this was their leader. You have come far, mountain man, the chief said, in heavily accented English. His voice was low but carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. Why? Elias dismounted slowly, keeping his rifle down. I came because of her, he said, motioning to Clara, and because someone branded her Apache lover and left her to die on my roof. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. A few younger warriors stiffened, their hands twitching toward their weapons. Clara slid off the mule, her eyes fixed on the chief. I know your people are blamed, Elias continued, but I don't believe this was your doing. I came to hear the truth from you. The chief studied him for a long moment, then gestured toward a nearby fire pit. We will talk. They sat cross-legged on the ground, the flames casting shadows over their faces. Several warriors formed a loose circle around them, their expressions guarded. Clara sat beside Elias, close enough that their shoulders touched. She came to us once, the chief said, nodding toward Clara. Last summer, she was running from white men who wished to claim her as property. We gave her shelter for a night and sent her on her way. But he looked directly at Clara. She also saved one of our children from drowning in the river that same day. My people have not forgotten. Clara swallowed, her voice soft. I thought you'd hate me for being white. The chief shook his head slowly. We hate only those who bring harm. You did not, Elias frowned. Then who would want to make it look like you did? A shadow crossed the chief's face. There is a man, Samuel Crow. He has long sought to stir hatred between our people and yours. He profits from fear-selling weapons, taking land after the soldiers burn it. Clara's hands clenched into fists. Crow, I've heard that name. He was one of the men who tried to take me. The chief nodded. He knows your survival would weaken his lies, so he made you a message, left where you would be found, marked as one of us to bring more blood. Elias felt heat rise in his chest, not from the fire, but from the cold rage settling deep inside him. Crow had nearly gotten Clara killed, and if Elias hadn't returned from hunting when he did, she would have died swinging from his roof. The chief leaned forward, his voice dropping. Crow is dangerous. He has men, but he is not untouchable. If you truly wish to end this, you must be willing to fight not just for her, but for the peace between our peoples. Clara looked at Elias, her eyes searching his. He met her gaze steadily. Then we fight, he said. The chief gave a slow nod. We will help you, but Crow will come soon. He cannot know you are alive until you are ready. As night deepened, the Apaches offered them food and shelter in a small hide tent. Lying on the furs, Clara whispered, Elias, thank you for believing me. He stared into the darkness, listening to the distant beat of Apache drums. You're alive because of it, and before this is over, Crow's going to wish you weren't. Somewhere beyond the canyon walls, the wind carried the faint echo of HOOFBEATS approaching. The night was still, save for the crackle of the fire in Elias Kane's cabin. Outside, snow had begun to fall, muting the world in a blanket of white. Inside, the air felt heavier not with the storm, but with the weight of the truths that had finally been laid bare. The blonde woman Samantha's had at the table, a mug of coffee between her hands. Her eyes were red from tears, but there was a fire in them now. The kind that came from surviving too much to ever bow again. Elias stood by the window, his rifle leaning against the wall. He scanned the tree line out of habit, though he knew the men who had done this to her were gone or dead. You'll need to decide where you go from here, he said quietly, without turning around. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she stared at the steam curling from her cup, as if the swirling tendrils might shape her future. I can't go back to the town, she said finally. Not after what they did. Not after what they think of me. Her voice wavered, but she didn't break. They'd rather see me swinging than walking free. Elias turned then, his weathered face shadowed by the dim lantern light. Then don't go back. The mountains don't ask questions. She gave him a faint smile, though there was sadness in it. And you think I can survive out here with nothing? You've got more than nothing, he replied. You've got your life. And you've got someone who won't let you freeze or starve. Silence settled again, broken only by the wind pushing against the log walls. Outside, the snow thickened, covering the tracks that had led them here. It felt like the world was erasing the violence of the past days, burying it under winter's cold mercy. But the past didn't stay buried. In the distance, far down the slope, a faint glow appeared, firelight. Elias' body tensed, his hand reaching instinctively for his rifle. Samantha noticed his change in posture and stood quickly. "It them?" she asked, fear slipping into her voice. "Could be," he muttered, watching the flicker. "Or someone else foolish enough to be out here in this weather." They waited, neither speaking, until the glow began to move, weaving slowly through the trees. Whoever it was, they were coming up the mountain. Elias pulled on his coat and hat. "Stay inside. Keep the fire low. If it's trouble, I'll send em back down the way they came." But Samantha was already pulling on her coat. "You're not going out there alone. Not after everything." He looked at her, wanting to argue, but seeing the stubbornness in her gaze, the same steel that had kept her alive when others wanted her dead, he only nodded. They stepped into the cold. The snow crunching beneath their boots. The night air burned in their lungs, and the wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke. The firelight below drew closer until shapes began to form, 3 riders, hunched against the storm. Elias raised his rifle. "Stop there," he called out. The riders halted, the lead figure raising empty hands. "We're not here to fight," a man's voice carried up through the wind. "We're here for her." Beside him, Samantha's breath hitched. Elias stepped forward, his rifle still ready. "You've got one chance to explain before I send you back down in the dark." The man removed his hat, revealing weather-beaten features and eyes that looked too tired for malice. "I'm her brother," he said simply. "We've been looking for her for months. Thought she was dead." The words hit like a hammer. Samantha froze, her mind a storm of disbelief and memories. "Daniel," she whispered. The man smiled faintly. "It's me, Sam." For a long moment, no one moved. Then she ran to him, snow flying under her boots. They embraced, clinging to each other, as if letting go would break the spell. The other 2 riders looked on silently, their faces solemn. Elias lowered his rifle, watching the reunion with a strange heaviness in his chest. He knew this might mean she'd leave, that the cabin would be quiet again, just him and the mountains. When she finally pulled away, she turned back to Elias. "They're my family," she said softly. But her voice faltered. "You saved me. I can't just ride away without you." "Don't owe me anything," Elias said, his voice steady but low. "Go with them. Be safe." For a moment, it seemed she might argue, but then she stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him. "I'll come back," she whispered. "I promise." By morning, the riders were gone, their tracks vanishing into the white. Elias stood on the porch, watching the snow fall. The mountains were quiet again, but somewhere deep inside, he knew the story wasn't over. Not for her, not for him,